name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 28 years I've been the family disappointment. While my sister Victoria married into old money and my brother Marcus climbed corporate ladders, I managed a small diner and lived paycheck to paycheck. But none of that prepared me for what happened at Grandpa Henry's will reading when my family erupted in laughter over my inheritance. A beat-up wooden cigar box filled with what they called worthless junk. They had no idea that those yellowed papers would make me wealthier than all of them combined, and that their mockery would be the last sound they'd make before learning the truth about real treasure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The law offices of Lawson & Associates occupied the 42nd floor of a gleaming Chicago high-rise, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking views of Lake Michigan. I pressed my palms against my thrift store dress as the elevator climbed, each floor marking another step toward what I knew would be an uncomfortable afternoon. Grandpa Henry had been gone for 3 weeks, and while I mourned the loss of the only family member who truly understood me, I couldn't shake the feeling that today would somehow change everything. The elevator doors opened to reveal a reception area that screamed expensive legal services, mahogany everything, leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and a receptionist whose jewelry could have funded my diner for a year. I approached her desk with the careful politeness of someone who didn't belong in such spaces, but had learned to navigate them anyway. My family was already assembled in the conference room when I arrived. Victoria sat at the head of the long table like she owned the place, her Hermes bag positioned just so on the polished surface, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming impatiently against her phone case. She wore that particular shade of confidence that came from never having to check her bank balance before making a purchase. Beside her, Jonathan adjusted his Rolex and scrolled through what I assumed were stock prices, his Brooks Brothers suit crisp despite the Chicago humidity. Marcus occupied the chair to Victoria's right, his own expensive suit, a testament to his success as a senior partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms. His wife Amanda sat beside him, her designer dress probably worth more than I made in 3 months at the Heritage Diner. They'd been whispering among themselves when I entered, their voices carrying that particular tone of people discussing someone they considered beneath their notice. The rest of the family filled out the remaining chairs. Aunt Caroline with her perpetually disapproving expression, Uncle Thomas who'd made his fortune in real estate, and Cousin Rebecca who'd married well and never let anyone forget it. They all turned to look at me as I entered, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to barely concealed disdain. I was the black sheep, the one who'd chosen a simple life over the Mitchell family tradition of accumulating wealth and status. I found a seat at the far end of the table, as far from the power center as possible. It had always been this way. Victoria and Marcus at the center of attention, the rest of the family orbiting around their success, and me somewhere in the outer darkness, tolerated but never truly welcomed. Today felt different though, charged with an energy I couldn't quite identify. Mr. Robert Lawson entered the room with the gravity befitting a man who'd been the Mitchell family attorney for over 3 decades. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suit impeccable, and his briefcase looked like it had cost more than my car. He greeted each family member by name, his handshake firm and professional. When he reached me, his expression softened slightly. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised me. "Your grandfather spoke of you often. He was very proud of you." I felt heat rise in my cheeks as Victoria's laugh tinkled across the room like broken crystal. "Proud of what exactly?" she asked, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Her thriving career in food service?" The room erupted in polite chuckles. Marcus shook his head with what he probably thought was fond exasperation. "Sarah's always been content with less," he said, as if contentment were a character defect. "Some people just aren't built for success." I'd heard variations of this conversation my entire adult life. When I'd chosen to study education instead of business. When I'd turned down Marcus's offer to work at his law firm as a paralegal. When I'd decided to manage the Heritage Diner instead of pursuing what Victoria called real career opportunities. They'd never understood that I'd found purpose in teaching children and meaning in running a place where neighbors gathered for coffee and conversation. To them, success was measured only in dollars and square footage. Mr. Lawson cleared his throat and opened his briefcase, withdrawing a thick folder and several sealed envelopes. "Before we begin," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in legal practice, "I want you to know that Henry spent considerable time crafting this will. Every decision was deliberate, every bequest carefully considered." Victoria leaned forward, her eyes bright with anticipation. She and Marcus had always assumed they'd inherit the bulk of Grandpa Henry's estate. The Lincoln Park mansion, the investment portfolio, the controlling interest in Mitchell Construction Company. It made sense, really. They were the successful ones, the ones who'd built upon the family legacy, the ones who moved in the right circles and made the right connections. "The primary estate," Mr. Lawson continued, "including the family home, the construction company shares, and the main investment portfolio, will be divided equally between Victoria Mitchell Blackwood and Marcus Mitchell." The relief in the room was palpable. Victoria actually clapped her hands together, and Marcus sat back in his chair with a satisfied smile. Jonathan was already pulling out his phone, probably calculating net worth, while Amanda whispered excitedly about redecorating the mansion. "There are, of course, smaller bequests for other family members," Mr. Lawson continued, reading from a list. "Aunt Caroline received a collection of antique jewelry, Uncle Thomas got Grandpa's vintage car collection, and Cousin Rebecca inherited his rare book collection. Each gift was met with polite thanks and genuine pleasure." Then Mr. Lawson's eyes found mine across the table. "And to Sarah Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying a strange undertone I couldn't interpret. "Henry leaves his personal effects and the contents of his study desk." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds before Victoria burst into laughter. Not the polite social laughter from earlier, but the kind of genuine amusement that comes from something truly ridiculous. "His desk?" she gasped between giggles. "Sarah gets desk clutter?" Marcus joined in, shaking his head in what might have been sympathy if it weren't for the smirk playing around his lips. "Well," he said, "at least you'll have some nice pens to remember him by." The entire room erupted in barely suppressed mirth. Uncle Thomas muttered something about appropriate gifts for appropriate people, while Aunt Caroline made sympathetic clucking sounds that somehow managed to be more insulting than outright mockery. Even the normally reserved Mr. Lawson seemed to be fighting back a smile. But then something shifted in his expression. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a wooden cigar box, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. The brass hinges had turned green with age, and the wood bore the kinds of scratches and dents that spoke of a long, useful life. "Specifically," Mr. Lawson said, setting the box on the table in front of me, "Sarah inherits this box and everything in it." The laughter in the room intensified. Victoria actually wiped tears from her eyes as she stared at the battered box. "Oh, Grandpa," she said with false fondness, "even in death, you had such a sense of humor." I reached for the box with hands that trembled slightly, not from embarrassment, but from something I couldn't quite name. The wood was warm beneath my fingers, and I could feel the weight of whatever was inside shifting as I pulled it toward me. There was something almost reverent about the way Mr. Lawson had presented it, something that didn't match the amused contempt radiating from my family. "Go ahead," Victoria encouraged with mock enthusiasm. "Open your treasure chest." The brass clasp opened with a soft click that seemed loud in the suddenly quiet room. Inside, nestled among what looked like random papers and old photographs, I could see the corner of what appeared to be official documents. The papers were yellowed with age, some bearing official seals, others covered in Grandpa Henry's careful handwriting. "Old receipts and grocery lists," Marcus diagnosed with authority, craning his neck to peer into the box. "Maybe some expired coupons. At least you can use them for kindling," Jonathan added helpfully, earning another round of chuckles from the assembled family. I lifted out the first document, a photograph of Grandpa Henry as a much younger man, standing beside a computer that looked like something from a museum. He was smiling broadly, his arm around the shoulders of someone I didn't recognize, and there was something written on the back in his familiar handwriting. but it was the papers beneath the photographs that made my breath catch. Even from a glance, I could see they weren't receipts or grocery lists. They were certificates of some kind, printed on heavy paper with official seals and signatures. The words "common stock" were clearly visible on the top document, along with a company name that made my heart skip a beat. I carefully lifted the first certificate, my eyes scanning the elegant script and official stamps. The room had grown quiet again, but this time it wasn't the expectant quiet of people waiting for entertainment. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a thunderclap. "Apple Computer Company," I read aloud, my voice barely above a whisper. 1,000 shares, purchased August 1980. The silence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Stretched thin as a wire. Victoria's smile faltered slightly, confusion replacing amusement in her eyes. "Apple?" she repeated, as if the word were foreign. I set the first certificate aside and lifted the second one. Microsoft Corporation, 500 shares, purchased March 1986. My voice was steadier now, though my hands still shook. The third certificate made me dizzy. Amazon.com, 2,000 shares, purchased May 1997. The laughter had died completely. Marcus leaned forward, his expression shifting from amusement to concern to something approaching alarm. "Those can't be real," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Grandpa Henry didn't know anything about technology. But even as he spoke, I could see him doing mental calculations, his lawyer's mind working through possibilities. Victoria had gone pale beneath her expertly applied makeup, and Jonathan was frantically tapping on his phone, probably looking up current stock prices. Mr. Lawson cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Henry was quite prescient about technology investments," he said carefully. "He began purchasing tech stocks in the early 1980s, long before most people understood their potential." I continued lifting certificates from the box, each one representing a company that had grown from startup to global powerhouse. Google, Tesla, Netflix. Some purchased so early that the share prices seemed almost fictional. There were also dividend records, stock splits documented in careful handwriting, and what appeared to be decades of meticulous record-keeping. At the bottom of the box, beneath all the certificates and photographs, I found a letter addressed to me in Grandpa Henry's handwriting. My name was written across the envelope in his careful script, and the paper was thick and expensive, the kind used for important communications. Victoria found her voice first, though it came out as a croak. "How much?" she began, then stopped and cleared her throat. "How much are those worth?" Jonathan's face had gone completely white as he stared at his phone screen. "Current Apple stock price is $847 per share," he said mechanically. "Microsoft is at $412. Amazon is trading at $3,215. The mathematics hung in the air like smoke. Even I could do the basic calculations, though the numbers seemed too large to be real. The Apple stock alone was worth over $800,000, and that was just one of many certificates in the box. Marcus stood up so quickly his chair rolled backward, his professional composure finally cracking. "There has to be a mistake," he said, his voice rising. "Grandpa Henry was a construction worker. He didn't have money for stock investments." But Mr. Lawson was shaking his head, a small smile playing around his lips. "Henry was many things," he said quietly. "He was a construction worker, yes, but he was also one of the most financially savvy men I've ever known. He lived modestly, saved aggressively, and invested wisely. He'd been planning for this moment for over 40 years. I opened the letter with fingers that barely functioned, the heavy paper unfolding to reveal pages of Grandpa Henry's careful handwriting. The first line made my eyes blur with tears. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you're reading this, then my family has finally shown their true colors, and you've discovered that sometimes the most valuable gifts come in the most humble packages." I looked up to find the entire room staring at me, their expressions ranging from shock to dawning horror as the implications began to sink in. Victoria's mouth was opening and closing like a fish, while Marcus had sunk back into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. The letter continued, And I read it aloud because somehow it felt important that everyone hear Grandpa Henry's words. You were the only one who ever visited me because you wanted to, not because you felt obligated. You were the only one who listened to my stories about the early days of computers, and didn't roll your eyes when I talked about investing in companies that most people had never heard of. My voice broke slightly as I continued reading. While your brother and sister were building their careers and accumulating impressive things, you were building a life based on kindness and genuine connection. You chose to teach children because you believed in their potential. You chose to manage the Heritage Diner because you understood that feeding people was about more than just serving food. It was about creating community. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming, could hear Uncle Thomas's ragged breathing, could hear Victoria's jewelry jingling as her hands shook. The stocks in this box represent more than 40 years of careful investment, I continued reading. I bought Apple when it was just 2 college dropouts in a garage. I bought Microsoft when Bill Gates was still an unknown programmer. I bought Amazon when it was just an online bookstore. I held on to every single share through crashes and bubbles and moments when everyone told me I was crazy. Mr. Lawson leaned forward, his professional demeanor giving way to something more personal. Sarah, he said quietly, your grandfather asked me to have those certificates independently appraised last month. The total value, based on current market prices and including all dividend reinvestments over the years, is approximately $47 million. The number hit the room like a physical blow. Amanda actually gasped, a small, sharp sound that seemed to echo in the suddenly airless space. Cousin Rebecca gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went white. Uncle Thomas made a sound that might have been a whimper. But Victoria's reaction was the most dramatic. She lurched to her feet, her chair falling backward with a crash that made everyone jump. 47 million? She shrieked, her carefully modulated voice cracking with emotion. $47 million in a fucking cigar box? The profanity hung in the elegant conference room like a obscenity shouted in church. Mr. Lawson winced slightly, while Marcus reached for his sister's arm in an attempt to calm her down. This is insane, Victoria continued, pacing behind her chair like a caged animal. He gave us the house and the business, but she gets $47 million in stock certificates? How is that fair? How is that even legal? Mr. Lawson's voice was calm but firm when he responded. Henry's will is entirely legal and properly executed. He was of sound mind when he made these decisions, and his reasoning was quite clear. He felt that Sarah would be the best steward of his investment legacy. I folded the letter carefully, my hands steadier now than they'd been all afternoon. The shock was wearing off, replaced by something deeper and more complex. Grief for Grandpa Henry, who'd carried this secret alone for so many years. Gratitude for his faith in me. And yes, a small, guilty sense of satisfaction at the looks of stunned disbelief on my family's faces. There's more, I said quietly, lifting out the final item from the box. It was another envelope, this one sealed with wax and bearing official-looking stamps. Investment account information for Grandpa Henry's brokerage firm. Everything's already been transferred to my name. The reality of the situation began to settle over the room like fog. Victoria sank back into her chair, her face pale except for 2 bright spots of color on her cheeks. Marcus was staring at his hands, his lawyer's mind probably working through the implications and finding no loopholes, no grounds for appeal. The house, Victoria said weakly. The construction company. They're worth maybe $3 million combined. Maybe 4 if the market's good. Jonathan nodded numbly. The investment portfolio Henry mentioned, based on what he told me last Christmas, it's probably worth around $2 million. The mathematics were stark and undeniable. While Victoria and Marcus had inherited traditional assets worth perhaps $5 or $6 million combined, I'd inherited a fortune that dwarfed their inheritance by a factor of 8. The sister they'd mocked for her simple lifestyle, the family disappointment who managed a diner and drove a 15-year-old Honda, had just become the wealthiest person in the room by an almost incomprehensible margin. Aunt Caroline was the first to break the stunned silence. Well, she said, her voice pitched artificially high, I suppose congratulations are in order. Her words seemed to release whatever spell had held the room frozen. Suddenly everyone was talking at once, voices overlapping in a cacophony of shocked reactions and belated attempts at warmth. "Sarah, darling, I always knew you were special," Cousin Rebecca gushed, reaching across the table to grasp my hand. "You must come to dinner soon. We have so much to catch up on." Uncle Thomas was nodding enthusiastically. "Your grandfather was always proud of you," he declared, as if he hadn't spent the last decade treating me like an embarrassing family secret. "He used to talk about your wisdom all the time." But Victoria and Marcus remained silent, their faces masks of barely controlled emotion. I could see the wheels turning in their minds, could practically hear them calculating what this meant for family dynamics, for holiday gatherings, for the carefully maintained hierarchy that had defined our relationships for so long. Mr. Lawson began gathering his papers, his professional mask back in place. "Sarah," he said, "I'll need you to come to my office tomorrow to complete the transfer paperwork. There are also some additional documents your grandfather wanted you to have. Investment strategies, contact information for his financial advisors, that sort of thing." I nodded, still feeling disconnected from the reality of the situation. $47 million. It was a number so large it felt abstract, like something that happened to other people in movies or news stories. But the certificates in my hands were real, the signatures and seals authentic, and Mr. Lawson's calm professionalism suggested this was exactly what it appeared to be. As the family began to file out of the conference room, their conversations muted and awkward, Victoria finally approached me. Her designer heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she moved, each step measured and deliberate. "Sarah," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I want you to know that I'm happy for you, truly, and I hope you'll remember that family is the most important thing." The words were perfectly chosen, delivered with just the right amount of warmth and sincerity. But I could see the calculation behind her eyes, could practically hear her mind working through angles and strategies. This was Victoria in damage control mode, the same woman who'd spent years treating me like a charity case, suddenly recognizing that the family dynamics had shifted in ways she was still struggling to understand. I smiled and nodded, because what else could I do? The afternoon had been surreal enough without adding family drama to the mix. But as I watched her leave, her perfect posture just slightly less perfect than usual, I couldn't help thinking about Grandpa Henry's letter and his words about people showing their true colors. The conference room emptied slowly, leaving just Mr. Lawson and me with the box of certificates and the weight of what had just happened. He packed his briefcase methodically, each document filed in its proper place. "Your grandfather wanted me to tell you something," he said as he snapped the briefcase closed. "He said you'd know what to do with the money, because you'd never forgotten that wealth is a tool, not a destination. He believed you'd use it to build something meaningful." I looked down at the cigar box, its scratched surface hiding decades of careful planning and patient investment. Grandpa Henry had worked construction for 40 years, living modestly in his Lincoln Park house, driving used cars and shopping at discount stores. But he'd also been quietly building a fortune, share by share, year by year, waiting for the right moment to reveal what he'd accomplished. The Heritage Diner suddenly felt very far away, as did my small apartment and my carefully budgeted life. But even as the magnitude of the change began to sink in, I found myself thinking not about what I could buy or where I could travel, but about what Grandpa Henry had said about building something meaningful. Tomorrow I would go to Mr. Lawson's office and sign papers that would make me wealthy beyond my wildest dreams. Tomorrow I would have to figure out how to manage a fortune that dwarfed anything I'd ever imagined. But today I was still Sarah Mitchell, the granddaughter who'd loved an old man enough to listen to his stories about computers and investments, and the importance of thinking long-term. As I walked to the elevator, the cigar box tucked securely under my arm, I could already hear my phone buzzing with messages. Word would spread quickly through the family network, and by evening everyone in our extended circle would know about the inheritance. There would be congratulations and requests for loans, invitations to exclusive events, and sudden interest in my opinions on everything from real estate to politics. But for now, in the quiet elegance of the elevator descending toward the Chicago streets, I held Grandpa Henry's final gift and thought about the patient wisdom of a man who'd understood that the most valuable treasures often come in the most humble packages. The family who'd laughed at my worthless junk, would soon learn that sometimes the last laugh belongs to the person everyone underestimated. The phone calls started before I even reached my car. The first came from Victoria, her voice tight with forced cheerfulness as she suggested we meet for lunch to discuss family matters. The second was from Marcus, proposing that I might benefit from his legal expertise in managing my windfall. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of the Heritage Diner, my voicemail was full of suddenly concerned relatives offering advice, assistance, and thinly veiled requests for financial support. I sat in my Honda Civic for a long moment, staring at the familiar red brick building that housed the diner where I'd worked for the past 6 years. The afternoon sun caught the chrome letters spelling out Heritage across the front window, and I could see the silhouettes of regular customers through the glass. Mrs. Patterson would be at her usual corner booth, working on her crossword puzzle over coffee that had long since gone cold. Jake the taxi driver would be grabbing his usual turkey sandwich before starting his evening shift. These were my people, the ones who knew me as Sarah the manager, not Sarah the heiress. The weight of the cigar box on the passenger seat felt heavier than its actual contents could account for. Inside those yellowed certificates lay a complete transformation of my life, but sitting here in the parking lot of a neighborhood diner, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of working-class Chicago, the whole afternoon felt like an elaborate dream. My phone buzzed again. This time it was David, my partner of 3 years, whose steady presence had been one of the few constants in my complicated relationship with my family. His text was characteristically simple. How did it go? Home by 6 for dinner? David taught high school chemistry and coached the debate team, and his idea of wealth was having enough saved for a summer camping trip. I wondered how I would even begin to explain what had happened in that conference room. I finally gathered the courage to enter the diner, the familiar bell above the door announcing my arrival with its cheerful chime. The afternoon shift was winding down, and Maria, the head waitress, looked up from wiping tables with a smile that quickly shifted to concern when she saw my expression. "Misha," she said, abandoning her cleaning to approach me. "You look like you've seen a ghost. The will reading was rough?" Maria had worked at the Heritage for 12 years, long enough to know the complicated dynamics of my family. She'd listened to me vent about Victoria's condescending comments and Marcus's casual dismissal of my choices. She'd been the one to cover my shifts when I'd needed time off to care for Grandpa Henry during his final illness. I opened my mouth to respond but found myself at a complete loss for words. How do you casually mention that you've just inherited $47 million? How do you explain that the family who'd spent years treating you like a disappointment had just discovered you were worth more than all of them combined? It was unexpected, I finally managed, which was perhaps the understatement of the century. The diner's familiar sounds surrounded me. The sizzle of the grill, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversation from the remaining customers. This place had been my sanctuary for years, the space where I'd found purpose in feeding people and creating a gathering place for the neighborhood. The regulars knew my name, shared their troubles over coffee, and treated me with the kind of genuine respect that my own family had never offered. But now, standing behind the counter where I'd spent countless hours, I felt like an imposter. The certificates in my purse represented more money than the Heritage Diner would earn in several lifetimes. They represented opportunities and responsibilities that I couldn't even begin to comprehend. Most unsettling of all, they represented my grandfather's faith in my judgment, a faith that felt both humbling and terrifying. I retreated to the small office behind the kitchen, needing space to process what had happened. The office was cramped and cluttered, filled with vendor invoices, employee schedules, and the daily detritus of running a small business. My desk was a battered metal thing that had probably been there since the 1970s, its surface scarred by years of use. The contrast between this humble space and the elegant conference room where I'd just inherited a fortune was almost comical. I pulled out my laptop and, after a moment's hesitation, began researching the companies whose stock certificates now belonged to me. Apple's current market capitalization was over $3 trillion. Microsoft wasn't far behind. Amazon had grown from Jeff Bezos's garage experiment into a global empire that had fundamentally changed how people shopped, worked, and lived. Grandpa Henry had been there at the beginning of all of it. While most people were dismissing personal computers as expensive toys for hobbyists, he'd recognized their potential and put his money where his vision was. While others saw online shopping as a fad that would never replace traditional retail, he'd invested in Amazon when it was still just selling books. He'd held on to every share through market crashes, technology bubbles, and moments when conventional wisdom suggested he should sell. The more I researched, the more astounded I became by the prescience of his investments. He hadn't just been lucky. He'd been genuinely ahead of his time, recognizing technological trends decades before they became obvious to everyone else. The man who'd spent his days pouring concrete and framing houses had apparently spent his evenings studying annual reports and technology magazines, quietly building a portfolio that would make professional investors weep with envy. My research was interrupted by a knock on the office door. David stood in the doorway, his teacher's bag slung over his shoulder and concern written across his features. He was still wearing the slightly rumpled button-down shirt and khakis that constituted his daily uniform, his dark hair mussed from running his hands through it, a habit that emerged whenever he was worried. "Maria said you looked upset," he said, closing the door behind him and settling into the ancient chair across from my desk. "She was worried you'd gotten bad news about the inheritance." I looked at the man I'd been building a life with for 3 years. David Chen was everything my family would consider unremarkable. A public school teacher with student loans, a modest apartment, and a 10-year-old Subaru that he maintained himself in his building's parking garage. He read voraciously, cooked elaborate meals on weekends, and spent his summers volunteering at literacy camps for underprivileged kids. Victoria had met him exactly twice, and both times had managed to communicate her disapproval without saying a single directly critical word. But David had been the one to hold me when Grandpa Henry was dying, sitting through long nights at the hospital and bringing me coffee that he'd somehow managed to make taste decent despite coming from a vending machine. He'd been the one to help me plan the funeral, dealing with arrangements and relatives while I struggled with grief. He'd never asked about inheritance or family money, had, in fact, seemed almost uncomfortable when the subject came up. "The news wasn't bad," I said carefully, still struggling with how to frame what had happened. "It was just significant." David had a teacher's patience, honed by years of dealing with teenagers who needed time to work through complex problems. He waited, his brown eyes steady and understanding, while I gathered my courage to continue. "Grandpa Henry left me something valuable," I said finally. "More valuable than I expected. More valuable than anyone expected." I pulled the letter from my purse and handed it to David, watching his expression as he read Grandpa Henry's words about stock investments and careful planning. His eyebrows rose slightly when he reached the part about 40 years of accumulating shares, but he didn't interrupt or exclaim. He simply read with the careful attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. When he finished reading, he folded the letter and handed it back to me. "How valuable are we talking about?" he asked quietly. $47 million. The number hung in the small office like a physical presence. David blinked once, twice, then leaned back in his chair with a soft whistle. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the sounds of the diner beyond the closed door, Maria calling out an order, the coffee machine hissing, the comfortable clatter of the dinner prep beginning. 47 million, David repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "That's more than we'd make in our entire lifetimes." "More than we'd make in several lifetimes," I corrected. "David, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to be wealthy. I've never wanted to be wealthy." He reached across the desk and took my hand, his fingers warm and calloused from weekend carpentry projects. "What did the rest of your family get?" I told him about the house and the construction company, about the traditional investments that had seemed so substantial until my inheritance was revealed. I described Victoria's shock and Marcus's stunned silence, the way the entire family dynamic had shifted in the space of a single afternoon. "They must be reeling," David said thoughtfully. "You've gone from being the family disappointment to being the family success story in about 30 minutes. "That's what scares me," I admitted. "They're already calling, wanting to get together, offering advice and assistance." Victoria suggested lunch. "Marcus wants to help me with legal matters." People who barely acknowledged my existence for years are suddenly very interested in maintaining family relationships. David nodded slowly. He'd witnessed enough of my family gatherings to understand the dynamics at play. He'd seen how Victoria's compliments always carried barbs, how Marcus's advice always came with subtle implications about my poor judgment. He'd been the one to comfort me after particularly brutal family dinners where my lifestyle choices had been dissected and found wanting. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "Not what you think you should do, or what your family expects. What do you actually want?" It was such a simple question, but it cut straight to the heart of everything I was struggling with. What did I want? For years, my wants had been simple: to do meaningful work, to build something lasting with David, to maintain the connections I'd found in this neighborhood and this diner. The money changed the parameters of those wants in ways I was still trying to understand. "I want to honor what Grandpa Henry intended," I said slowly. "He didn't leave me this money to spend on luxury cars and designer clothes. He left it because he thought I'd do something meaningful with it." What would meaningful look like? I thought about the letter, about Grandpa Henry's words regarding community and genuine connection. I thought about the Heritage Diner and the role it played in the neighborhood, not just as a place to eat, but as a gathering spot where people knew each other's names and stories. I thought about my brief teaching career and how fulfilling it had been to watch students discover their own potential. "I think he wanted me to build something," I said. "Not just accumulate wealth, but create something that would matter to people." David smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since he'd arrived. "That sounds like the Sarah I know. The one who turned down a corporate job to manage a diner because she believed in what this place meant to people. But how do you responsibly manage $47 million? I asked. "How do you make sure you're not just throwing money at problems? How do you know if you're making a difference or just making yourself feel better?" "Same way you approached managing this place," David said pragmatically. "You learn what you don't know, you find people who are smarter than you to teach you, and you make decisions based on your values instead of your fears." The office felt smaller suddenly, cramped and inadequate for the conversation we were having. I could hear my phone buzzing again in my purse, probably another family member reaching out with sudden interest in my well-being. The contrast between this humble space and the magnitude of what I'd inherited was almost overwhelming. "There's something else," I said, pulling the stock certificates from the cigar box. "These aren't just valuable because of current market prices. Grandpa Henry has been reinvesting dividends for decades. Some of these holdings have split multiple times. The Apple stock alone has probably multiplied by a factor of several hundred since he first bought it." David studied the certificates with the careful attention he brought to laboratory experiments. He really was ahead of his time, wasn't he? These companies weren't obvious winners when he invested in them. According to the dates on these certificates, he bought Apple stock when the company was less than 5 years old, Microsoft when it was still primarily a software company for hobbyists, Amazon when it was just an online bookstore that most people thought would never compete with traditional retail. So he wasn't just lucky, David mused. He was genuinely prescient about technology trends, which means he probably had good reasons for leaving this to me instead of Victoria or Marcus, I said, the realization hitting me as I spoke. He didn't just want someone to inherit money. He wanted someone who would understand the responsibility that came with it. The weight of that responsibility settled over me like a physical presence. $47 million represented more than personal wealth. It represented opportunity to effect real change, to address problems that mattered, to build something lasting. But it also represented the potential for tremendous mistakes, for good intentions that produced harmful consequences, for the kind of hubris that came with sudden wealth. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Victoria's name, and I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, Marcus called. Then Aunt Caroline. Then Uncle Thomas. Each call went unanswered, adding to the growing collection of messages from family members who had suddenly discovered urgent reasons to connect with me. "They're persistent," David observed as the phone rang for the 4th time in 10 minutes. "They're scared," I corrected. "For the first time in their lives, I have something they want. They're not sure how to handle that." David was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what I'd said. "How does it feel?" he asked finally. "Having that kind of power over people who've always treated you as less than?" It was a question I'd been avoiding, even in my own thoughts. There was a part of me, a small, petty part that I wasn't proud of, that was enjoying the role reversal. After years of being dismissed and condescended to, there was satisfaction in watching my family scramble to adjust their behavior. The memory of Victoria's shocked expression when the stock certificates were revealed would probably make me smile for years to come. But there was also something deeply uncomfortable about the sudden change in how I was being treated. The phone calls and lunch invitations felt hollow, motivated by financial calculation rather than genuine affection. It was as if I'd become a different person in their eyes, worthy of attention and respect solely because of numbers in a bank account. "It feels strange," I said honestly. "Part of me wants to enjoy it, to let them grovel a little after years of treating me like the family failure. But mostly it just makes me sad. It confirms everything I already suspected about what they really value." "Which is why your grandfather left the money to you instead of them," David said gently. He knew the difference between people who see wealth as a tool and people who see it as a scoreboard. The afternoon was shifting toward evening, and I could hear the dinner rush beginning in the main dining room. Maria would be handling the transition between shifts, managing the chaos with the efficiency born of years of experience. This was my world. The practical, immediate challenges of feeding people and keeping a small business running. The abstract wealth represented by those stock certificates felt foreign by comparison. But even as I sat in that familiar office, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of the Heritage Diner, I could feel something fundamental shifting inside me. The money changed things whether I wanted it to or not. It opened doors I'd never imagined, created opportunities I'd never considered, and imposed responsibilities I was still learning to understand. "I need to figure out what to do about my family," I said, voicing the immediate challenge that felt most pressing. "They're not going to stop calling until I respond, and I'm not ready to navigate whatever games they're planning to play." David considered this for a moment. "What if you didn't play games at all? What if you just told them the truth, that you need time to process what's happened before making any decisions about anything?" "They won't like that. Victoria especially. She's probably already planning ways to position herself as my advisor, my connection to high society, my guide to managing wealth." "Let her plan," David said with a slight smile. "Planning doesn't mean you have to participate." It was such a simple observation, but it cut through the anxiety I'd been feeling about managing family expectations. I didn't have to respond to every call or accept every invitation. I didn't have to make decisions about relationships or investments or lifestyle changes just because other people were eager for me to do so. The money might have changed my circumstances, but it didn't have to change my fundamental approach to living my life. "I want to wait," I said, the decision crystallizing as I spoke. "I want to take time to understand what this inheritance really means before I start changing everything else." "That seems wise," David agreed, "especially since this is permanent. Whatever you do with this money, you'll have to live with the consequences for the rest of your life." The rest of my life. The phrase carried a weight I hadn't fully considered. I was 28 years old, which meant I potentially had 50 or 60 years to manage this wealth responsibly. 50 or 60 years to make decisions that would affect not just my life, but the lives of people and communities I chose to support. 50 or 60 years to either honor Grandpa Henry's faith in my judgment or prove that he'd made a terrible mistake. My phone buzzed with a text message. This time it was from a number I didn't recognize, but the message made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Sarah, this is Rebecca Walsh from Channel 7 News. We understand there was an interesting development at the Mitchell family will reading today. Would you be available for an interview?" I showed the message to David, whose expression darkened immediately. "How did they find out already?" "Someone talked," I said, though even as I spoke I realized it could have been any number of people. The law office staff, the family members who'd been in the conference room, even other relatives who'd heard the news secondhand. $47 million was the kind of story that traveled fast, especially when it involved a dramatic reversal of family fortunes. "This is why you need time," David said firmly. "Not just to figure out what to do with the money, but to figure out how to protect yourself from everyone who's going to want a piece of it." The phone rang again. This time it was a number with a New York area code, then another call from a Chicago number I didn't recognize. The news was spreading, and with it would come a level of attention I had never experienced and wasn't prepared to handle. I turned off my phone and sat back in my chair, looking around the small office that had been my professional sanctuary for years. Tomorrow, everything would be different. Tomorrow, I would have to start learning how to be wealthy, how to manage attention I didn't want, how to navigate relationships with family members whose motivations I now questioned more than ever. But tonight I was still Sarah Mitchell, manager of the Heritage Diner, sitting in a cramped office with the man I loved and trying to figure out how to honor my grandfather's memory while staying true to the values that had guided my life so far. "I have an idea," David said suddenly. "What if we went home, ordered pizza, and pretended this whole thing didn't happen for just one evening? What if we gave ourselves tonight to be normal before everything changes tomorrow?" It was perhaps the most appealing suggestion I'd heard all day. One last evening of simplicity before stepping into a tummatfegsit. Life I didn't yet understand. One last night of being ordinary before becoming someone that everyone wanted something from. "I think Grandpa Henry would approve of that plan," I said, carefully placing the stock certificates back in their cigar box. "He always said the most important thing was to remember who you are, regardless of what you have." As we prepared to leave the diner, I took one last look around the office. Tomorrow I would have to start making decisions about money and family and responsibility that would affect the rest of my life. Tomorrow I would have to figure out how to be worthy of my grandfather's faith and wise enough to use his gift well. But tonight, I was still just Sarah, walking out into the Chicago evening with David's hand in mine, and a secret that would change everything tucked safely in an old wooden box. The morning brought new challenges that I hadn't anticipated. My phone, which I'd optimistically turned back on while making coffee, immediately erupted with a cascade of notifications that made me nearly drop my mug. 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and 12 voicemails had accumulated overnight. But it wasn't just family members anymore. Reporters, financial advisors, charity representatives, and people claiming to be long-lost friends had somehow obtained my number and were eager to discuss my situation. David emerged from the shower to find me staring at my phone in bewilderment, a piece of toast growing cold in my hand. "How bad is it?" he asked, though my expression probably answered his question. "Someone leaked my name to the press," I said, scrolling through messages from journalists asking for exclusive interviews. Channel 7, The Tribune. Even some blogger who runs a website about Chicago's wealthy families. They all want to talk about the Cinderella inheritance and the quote diner heiress. The labels stung more than I expected. Reducing my life to a fairy tale narrative felt dismissive of everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built at the Heritage. I wasn't Cinderella waiting to be rescued by wealth. I was a woman who'd chosen a different path and happened to inherit money that validated my grandfather's faith in me. But the media attention was just the beginning. As David and I sat at our small kitchen table, trying to process the overnight explosion of interest in my life, I realized that yesterday's revelation had set in motion changes I was completely unprepared to handle. The comfortable anonymity I'd enjoyed for 28 years was gone, replaced by a level of scrutiny that felt invasive and overwhelming. A knock at our apartment door interrupted my mounting anxiety. Through the peephole, I could see a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair holding a microphone, while behind her a man adjusted a professional camera. They'd found our address somehow, and they were clearly prepared to wait as long as necessary for a statement. "We can't leave," David said quietly, peering through the blinds at the news van parked on our street. "There are 2 more crews setting up down the block." The reality of my situation began to crystallize in ways that felt surreal. Less than 24 hours ago, I'd been completely unknown outside my small circle of family, friends, and regular customers. Now I was apparently newsworthy enough to warrant teams of reporters camping outside my apartment. The wealth that Grandpa Henry had accumulated over decades of careful investment had transformed me overnight from a private citizen into a public figure. My laptop was open on the coffee table, and with a mixture of curiosity and dread, I began searching for coverage of yesterday's will reading. The first article one found was from a local business blog with the headline, "Mystery Heiress Inherits Tech Fortune, Local diner manager becomes multi-millionaire. The piece was surprisingly accurate in its basic facts, though it played up the dramatic elements in ways that made me cringe. But it was the comments section that really unsettled me. Dozens of strangers were speculating about my worthiness, my family relationships, and what I planned to do with the money. Some commenters questioned whether I had somehow manipulated my grandfather, while others defended my right to inherit whatever he chose to leave me. Reading strangers debate my character and motivations felt deeply violating. "Listen to this," I said, reading aloud from one particularly harsh comment. "Another case of an old man being taken advantage of by a scheming relative. No way a construction worker legitimately had $47 million to leave anyone. This whole story smells fishy." David moved to sit beside me on the couch, his arm wrapping around my shoulders in a gesture of protection that I desperately needed. "Don't read the comments," he said firmly. "Nothing good ever comes from reading comments on news stories." But I couldn't seem to stop myself. Comment after comment dissected my life, my choices, my relationship with my family. Some people had apparently done enough research to find photos of me from the Heritage Diner's social media accounts, analyzing my appearance and lifestyle for clues about my character. Others had found information about David, speculating about whether our relationship would survive my newfound wealth. The invasion of privacy felt breathtaking in its scope and speed. In less than a day, I'd gone from being a private person to having strangers analyze my life choices and make predictions about my future. The money that was supposed to provide security and opportunity had instead made me vulnerable in ways I'd never imagined. My phone rang again, this time showing Victoria's name. Against my better judgment, I answered, hoping that speaking with family might provide some anchor of normalcy in the chaos that my life had become. "Sarah, thank God." Victoria's voice was pitched higher than usual, carrying a note of genuine distress that surprised me. "Have you seen the news coverage? They're making our entire family look like gold diggers and fortune hunters. We need to control this narrative before it gets completely out of hand." The irony of Victoria worrying about appearing to be a gold digger wasn't lost on me, but her distress seemed genuine. I could hear traffic in the background, suggesting she was in her car, probably driving somewhere to handle what she perceived as a crisis. "I didn't ask for this attention," I said, watching through the blinds as another news van pulled up to the curb. "I haven't talked to any reporters. I haven't even left my apartment." "That's part of the problem," Victoria said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when she thought someone needed her guidance. "Your silence is letting other people define the story. You need to get ahead of this, make a statement, show that you're a responsible steward of this inheritance." The word steward caught my attention. It suggested that Victoria saw my inheritance not as my property, but as something I was temporarily managing on behalf of some larger interest, presumably the family's reputation and legacy. It was a subtle but important distinction that revealed how she was thinking about the situation. "What kind of statement did you have in mind?" I asked, though I was already suspicious of whatever she might suggest. "Something dignified and humble," Victoria said, her media relations experience evident in how quickly she shifted into crisis management mode. "Acknowledge that you're honored by your grandfather's trust, emphasize your commitment to using the inheritance responsibly, maybe mention some charitable intentions. Show people that you understand the responsibility that comes with this kind of wealth." There was logic to her suggestion, but something about the way she phrased it made me uncomfortable. The emphasis on humility and responsibility felt like subtle messaging that I was unworthy of the inheritance but willing to prove myself. It positioned me as someone who needed to justify my grandfather's decision, rather than someone who had earned his trust. "I'm not ready to make any public statements," I said finally. "I need time to process what's happened before I start making pronouncements about anything." The silence on Victoria's end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice had cooled considerably. "Sarah, I understand this is overwhelming, but you can't just hide from the situation. This affects all of us. The family name, the business relationships we've built, even my husband's clients are asking questions. You have a responsibility to consider how your actions affect other people." The manipulation was expertly done, framing her desire to control the narrative as concern for family reputation, positioning my need for privacy as selfishness that harmed others. It was classic Victoria, using guilt and obligation to pressure people into doing what she wanted. But this time, I had something she needed from me, which changed the dynamic in ways she was still learning to navigate. "I'll call you when I'm ready to discuss this," I said, and hung up before she could respond. David had been listening to my side of the conversation with growing concern. "She's trying to manage you the same way she always has," he observed. "She just doesn't realize that the balance of power has shifted." He was right, but understanding Victoria's motivations didn't solve the immediate problem of media attention and public scrutiny. As if to emphasize the point, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm a producer with CNN. We'd like to offer you an exclusive interview opportunity to tell your story in your own words. Please call me at your earliest convenience." CNN. The story had apparently grown beyond local Chicago media into national news. I was becoming the face of something. Wealth inequality, family drama, or just the kind of human interest story that captured people's attention during slow news cycles. Whatever I was becoming, it wasn't something I'd chosen or wanted. "We need help," David said, voicing what I'd been reluctant to admit. "This is beyond anything either of us knows how to handle." He was absolutely right. I was a diner manager whose most complicated professional challenge had been scheduling staff and managing food costs. I had no experience with media relations, wealth management, or the kind of public attention that came with sudden fortune. I needed guidance from people who understood these complexities, but I also needed to be careful about who I trusted. I thought about Mr. Lawson's offer to introduce me to Grandpa Henry's financial advisors. Yesterday, that had seemed premature, a concern for some future version of myself who'd had time to adjust to being wealthy. Today, it felt like an urgent necessity. I found Mr. Lawson's business card and called his office, hoping he might have advice about managing the immediate crisis of unwanted attention. His secretary put me through immediately, suggesting that he'd been expecting my call. "Sarah," his voice carried a warmth that I desperately needed. "I assume you've discovered that inheriting a large fortune brings complications you didn't anticipate." "That's an understatement," I said, looking out the window at the growing collection of news vans. "I can't leave my apartment without being ambushed by reporters, and my family is pressuring me to make public statements I'm not ready for." "This is precisely why your grandfather worked with our firm for so many years," Mr. Lawson said. "We understand that wealth brings responsibilities and challenges that extend far beyond financial management. Would you be available to meet with our crisis management team this afternoon?" Crisis management team. The phrase suggested that what I was experiencing wasn't unique, that other people had navigated similar situations with professional help. The relief I felt was overwhelming, the prospect of having experienced guidance instead of trying to figure everything out myself. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Whatever time works for you. Let's say 3 o'clock. And Sarah, don't make any statements or commitments to anyone until we've had a chance to discuss strategy. The decisions you make in the next few days will affect how this situation resolves." After ending the call, I felt marginally more hopeful about navigating the chaos that my life had become. But even as I prepared to seek professional help, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in ways that couldn't be reversed. The privacy and anonymity I'd taken for granted were gone, replaced by a level of public interest that felt both flattering and frightening. The irony wasn't lost on me that Grandpa Henry's gift, intended to provide security and opportunity, had instead made me vulnerable to scrutiny and pressure from people who'd never cared about my well-being before. The money that was supposed to represent freedom had instead created new forms of obligation and expectation. David spent the morning researching security services and private transportation options, practical concerns that had never occurred to me before but now seemed essential. "We can't keep living like prisoners in our own apartment," he said, showing me websites for companies that specialized in protecting high-profile individuals. "And you can't manage $47 million from hiding." He was right, but the practical implications of our new reality were staggering. Security services, financial advisors, media consultants, legal representatives, the infrastructure required to manage wealth safely was complicated and expensive. I was beginning to understand that being rich was itself a full-time job, requiring skills and knowledge I didn't possess. But more than the practical challenges, I was struggling with the psychological adjustment of having my private life become public property. The comments and speculation about my character felt deeply personal, as if strangers were dissecting my soul for entertainment. The attention that wealth brought wasn't just intrusive, it was dehumanizing in ways I hadn't anticipated. By noon, the media presence outside our apartment had grown to include not just local news crews, but photographers with impressive telephoto lenses and reporters from financial publications. Someone had apparently shared our address widely enough that we'd become a tourist attraction of sorts, with people driving by slowly to gawk at the building where the diner heiress lived. "This can't be legal," David said, watching a photographer position himself on the sidewalk directly across from our bedroom window. "There have to be privacy laws that prevent this kind of harassment." But as I researched privacy protections online, I discovered that inheriting a large fortune apparently made you a public figure by default, subject to far less privacy protection than ordinary citizens. The money that was supposed to provide security had instead made me vulnerable to legal forms of stalking and harassment. The weight of the situation was becoming overwhelming. Less than 48 hours ago, I'd been anonymous and content, managing a small business and building a quiet life with David. Now I was trapped in my own apartment, fielding calls from reporters and family members, trying to figure out how to manage wealth I'd never wanted and attention I'd never sought. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from Marcus. "Sarah, we need to talk immediately. The family is meeting this evening to discuss how to handle this situation. Your presence is required." Required. Not requested or hoped for, but required. As if my newfound wealth came with obligations to submit to family management. As if the money that made me financially independent had somehow made me more beholden to people who'd never shown genuine interest in my well-being. I showed the message to David, whose jaw tightened as he read it. "They're treating you like a child who needs supervision," he observed. "As if inheriting money somehow disqualified you from making your own decisions." The pattern was becoming clear. My family's response to my inheritance wasn't celebration or support. It was an immediate attempt to reassert control over me through different means. Where they'd once used condescension and dismissal, they were now using obligation and crisis management. The tactics had changed, but the underlying assumption remained the same, that I couldn't be trusted to handle important matters without their guidance. But I wasn't the same person who'd sat quietly through years of family gatherings, absorbing their criticism and accepting their judgment. The inheritance hadn't just changed my financial situation. It had revealed the true nature of relationships I'd been trying to preserve out of misplaced loyalty. Seeing how quickly my family had shifted from dismissal to manipulation was clarifying in ways that were both painful and liberating. I turned off my phone and set it aside, choosing silence over the constant pressure of other people's agendas. In a few hours, I would meet with Mr. Lawson's crisis management team and begin learning how to navigate wealth responsibly. I would start building the infrastructure necessary to manage my inheritance wisely and protect myself from the kind of exploitation that apparently came with sudden fortune. But for now, I sat with David in our small apartment, surrounded by the chaos of unwanted attention but anchored by the one relationship that had remained constant through everything. The man beside me hadn't changed his behavior or expectations based on my financial circumstances. He was still offering the same steady support and practical wisdom that had drawn me to him in the first place. "Whatever we figure out," David said, seeming to read my thoughts, "we figure out together. This money doesn't change who you are or what matters to you. It just changes what's possible." His words carried a truth I desperately needed to hear. The inheritance was an opportunity, not an identity. The wealth was a tool, not a definition of my worth. Whatever came next, I would approach it with the same values that had guided my life so far, seeking to honor my grandfather's faith while staying true to the principles that had earned his trust in the first place. Outside, the media circus continued, but inside our small apartment, I felt a growing sense of clarity about what I needed to do. The family meeting Marcus had demanded would have to wait. The public statements Victoria wanted me to make could be postponed indefinitely. The immediate crisis of unwanted attention would be handled by professionals who understood these challenges. But the deeper work of deciding how to use this inheritance wisely, that would take time, careful thought, and the kind of principled decision-making that had characterized my grandfather's approach to both business and life. Rushed decisions made under pressure rarely served anyone well, and I refused to let other people's urgency dictate choices that would affect the rest of my life. The afternoon sun filtered through our closed blinds, casting patterns on the wall that reminded me of the way light had fallen through the stained glass windows of yesterday's law office. Less than 2 days ago, I'd sat in that conference room expecting to inherit some personal mementos and walked out with a fortune that would reshape everything about my future. Now, sitting in the home David and I had built together, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of a life interrupted but not destroyed, I began to see the inheritance not as a burden or a windfall, but as a responsibility that would require the best of everything my grandfather had taught me about patience, wisdom, and the importance of staying true to your values, regardless of external pressures. The money would change many things, but it didn't have to change the core of who I was or what I believed mattered most. That realization, more than any amount of wealth, felt like the real treasure my grandfather had left me. The understanding that true security came not from having money, but from knowing who you were regardless of what you possessed. The crisis management meeting at Lawson & Associates felt like entering a war room designed by interior decorators. 3 professionals sat around a polished conference table, each armed with tablets, legal pads, and the kind of focused intensity that suggested they'd handled situations like mine before. Elena Rodriguez, the lead crisis consultant, was a woman in her 40s whose sharp suit and direct gaze immediately commanded respect. Beside her sat James Park, a media relations specialist whose calm demeanor suggested he'd weathered storms far worse than my current predicament. The third member of their team was Dr. Michael Torres, a wealth psychologist whose presence initially puzzled me, until Elena explained that sudden inheritance often created psychological challenges that required professional support. "Let's start with immediate concerns," Elena said, opening a folder thick with printed articles about my inheritance. "The media attention will peak within the next 72 hours, and then begin to fade, unless we do something to reignite it. Your family's pressure for public statements is predictable but manageable. The real challenge is establishing boundaries that protect your privacy, while allowing you to access the resources you need to manage your inheritance responsibly." James pulled up a tablet showing social media analytics that made my stomach turn. "The story has been shared over 50,000 times across various platforms," he said matter-of-factly. "Most of the commentary is positive. People love underdog stories. But there's enough speculation about your grandfather's mental state and your motives to cause problems if left unaddressed." The idea that strangers were questioning Grandpa Henry's mental competence felt like a personal attack. He'd been sharp and engaged until his final week, spending hours discussing technology trends and investment strategies with a clarity that had impressed even his doctors. The suggestion that I'd somehow manipulated him was not just false, but deeply offensive. "We recommend a carefully crafted statement," Elena continued, "not defending against specific accusations, but establishing your character and intentions. Something that acknowledges the responsibility you feel while maintaining your right to privacy during this transition." Dr. Torres leaned forward, his voice gentle but authoritative. "Sarah, it's important to understand that what you're experiencing isn't unusual. Sudden wealth creates a form of psychological displacement that can be extremely disorienting. You're not just adjusting to having money, you're adjusting to a completely different social position and the expectations that come with it." His words resonated in ways I hadn't expected. The disorientation I'd been feeling wasn't just about media attention or family pressure, it was about fundamental questions of identity and belonging. The wealth had separated me from my previous life without clearly establishing what my new life should look like. "The good news," Dr. Torres continued, "is that people who inherit wealth later in life, after establishing their own values and identity, typically navigate these challenges more successfully than those who grow up wealthy. You have a foundation of authentic relationships and genuine accomplishments that money can't undermine." Elena opened another folder, this one containing what appeared to be strategic planning documents. "We need to address 3 immediate issues: media management, family boundary setting, and wealth protection. The order matters because each decision affects the others." Over the next 2 hours, they walked me through options I'd never considered. Media management wasn't just about avoiding reporters. It was about controlling information flow to prevent misrepresentation. Family boundary setting involved legal protections against manipulation and pressure, including documentation of my mental competence and decision-making capacity. Wealth protection encompassed everything from security services to investment strategies, designed to preserve capital while generating sustainable income. The complexity was overwhelming, but what struck me most was how thoughtfully Elena's team approached each challenge. They weren't just offering tactical solutions, they were helping me understand the strategic implications of every choice. It was exactly the kind of careful, long-term thinking that had characterized Grandpa Henry's approach to both business and life. "There's one more thing," Elena said as our meeting wound down. "Your family has retained their own crisis management firm. They're planning to position themselves as concerned relatives trying to protect you from making poor decisions." It's a common dynamic when wealth distribution creates family tension. The news shouldn't have surprised me, but it felt like a betrayal, nonetheless. While I'd been struggling to process my inheritance privately, my family had been strategizing about how to control the narrative publicly. They'd moved from manipulation to open warfare in less than 48 hours. "What does that mean practically?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "It means they're going to escalate pressure for you to accept their guidance," James explained. "Expect more family meetings, more demands for transparency about your intentions, possibly even suggestions that you're not capable of managing this responsibility alone." Dr. Torres nodded grimly. Families often have difficulty accepting that inheritance creates new power dynamics. The person who receives unexpected wealth suddenly has options and independence that threaten established hierarchies. As I left the law office that afternoon, armed with a communications strategy and the beginnings of a wealth management plan, I felt more prepared to face whatever my family might throw at me. Elena's team had given me something invaluable: permission to prioritize my own judgment over other people's expectations. But the real test came that evening when Marcus called to inform me that the family meeting was mandatory, not optional. His voice carried an edge I'd never heard before, a combination of desperation and authority that suggested he was struggling to maintain control over a situation that was spiraling beyond his influence. "Sarah, this isn't just about you anymore," he said when I tried to politely decline. "The whole family is being affected by this media circus. Victoria's husband is fielding questions from clients about whether our family is involved in some kind of financial scandal. Uncle Thomas is getting calls from business associates who want to know if there's more to this story than what's being reported." The irony was breathtaking. For years, my family had treated me as an embarrassment, someone whose modest lifestyle and career choices reflected poorly on the Mitchell name. Now they were concerned about family reputation because my inheritance had made me newsworthy in ways they couldn't control. "I'm not responsible for other people's speculation," I said, drawing on the language Elena's team had helped me practice. "I inherited money from my grandfather, and I'm handling that inheritance responsibly with professional guidance." "Professional guidance from who?" Marcus demanded. "You've been making decisions without consulting family members who have decades of experience managing wealth and business relationships." The assumption underlying his criticism was that my family's expertise automatically trumped any outside advice I might seek. It was the same pattern of condescension that had characterized our relationship for years, just applied to a new context. Marcus couldn't conceive that I might be capable of making good decisions independently. "I'm working with Grandpa Henry's legal and financial team," I said calmly, "the same people who helped him build this fortune over 40 years. The silence that followed suggested Marcus was recalculating his approach. He'd apparently assumed I was fumbling through the inheritance without guidance, making me vulnerable to family intervention. Learning that I had professional support changed the dynamics in ways he was still processing. "Fine," he said finally, "but you still owe it to the family to coordinate our response to this situation. We need to present a unified front instead of letting reporters pit us against each other." There was logic to his concern, but I'd learned enough from Elena's team to recognize the manipulation embedded in his reasonable-sounding request. A unified front would mean accepting family leadership in managing my inheritance, something I was no longer willing to do. "I'm happy to keep the family informed about general decisions," I said, "but I won't be coordinating my choices with anyone. This inheritance comes with responsibilities I take seriously, and I plan to handle them based on my own judgment. Marcus's response was immediate and sharp. Your own judgment? Sarah, 48 hours ago you were managing a diner. Now you think you're qualified to handle investments worth more than most people make in their entire lives? The attack was personal and designed to undermine my confidence, but it also revealed the fundamental way Marcus viewed both me and the inheritance. To him, wealth was a reward for existing accomplishments rather than a tool for creating new opportunities. He couldn't imagine that managing money wisely might require different skills than accumulating it in the first place. Grandpa Henry thought I was qualified, I said simply. His judgment is the only one that matters in this situation. After ending the call, I felt both exhausted and oddly liberated. The conversation with Marcus had clarified something important. My family's concerns about reputation and coordination were secondary to their desire to maintain control over me. They weren't trying to protect my interests. They were trying to protect their own position in a hierarchy that my inheritance had disrupted. David found me sitting on our couch afterward, staring at my phone and processing the implications of what had just happened. How bad was it? He asked, settling beside me with the careful attention he brought to students who were struggling with difficult concepts. He essentially told me I'm too stupid to manage my own inheritance, I said, summarizing the conversation. The family wants to present a unified front, which apparently means letting them make decisions about my money. And you told him no. I told him no. David smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since this whole situation began. Good. Your grandfather left that money to you, not to the Mitchell family committee. Over the following weeks, the pattern of family pressure intensified in ways that were both predictable and revealing. Victoria began scheduling lunch dates, where she'd casually mention investment opportunities that her husband's firm was managing, always framed as family favors rather than business pitches. Marcus forwarded articles about inheritance fraud and the importance of family oversight, subtle suggestions that I needed protection from my own poor judgment. But the most telling response came from extended family members who'd barely acknowledged my existence for years. Suddenly, cousins were calling to catch up, aunts were sending thoughtful cards, and relatives I'd seen maybe twice in my adult life were expressing deep concern about my well-being. The attention felt hollow and transactional, motivated by possibility rather than genuine affection. The media attention eventually faded as Elena had predicted, but not before generating enough coverage to permanently change how I was perceived in my neighborhood and professional community. Regular customers at the Heritage Diner began treating me differently, some with newfound deference that made me uncomfortable, others with suspicion about my motives for continuing to work there. The most difficult conversation came with Maria, the head waitress who'd been like a second mother to me for years. She approached me during a quiet afternoon shift, her expression troubled and uncertain. Mija, she said, settling into the booth across from me, people are saying things. They're wondering why you're still here, still working, when you don't need the money anymore. The question she didn't ask directly was whether my continued presence at the diner was genuine or performative, whether I was staying out of authentic commitment or because wealthy people were supposed to demonstrate humility by maintaining connections to their previous lives. This place matters to me, I said honestly. The work matters, the relationships matter. Money doesn't change that. Maria studied my face with the careful attention she brought to reading people's real intentions. But it does change things, doesn't it? You could buy this place tomorrow if you wanted. You could buy the whole block. She was right, and we both knew it. The wealth created an asymmetry in our relationship that couldn't be ignored or wished away. No matter how much I valued her friendship and guidance, the financial disparity between us was now so vast that it affected every interaction. I don't want to buy anything, I said. I want to keep doing work that feels meaningful with people I care about. And when you get tired of playing normal? Maria asked gently. When you decide you want to live like a rich person instead of pretending to be regular folk? The question stung because it contained an assumption I hadn't fully recognized. That my current choices were temporary, a phase I'd outgrow once I accepted my new social position. Even people who knew me well found it difficult to believe that wealth wouldn't eventually change my fundamental priorities. But Maria's skepticism forced me to examine my own motivations more honestly. Was I staying at the diner because the work genuinely fulfilled me, or because I was afraid of embracing the opportunities that came with wealth? Was I demonstrating authentic values, or performing a version of humility that made me feel morally superior to my family? The questions were uncomfortable because they didn't have simple answers. The inheritance had given me choices I'd never had before, and choosing to maintain my previous lifestyle was itself a form of privilege that not everyone could afford. I had the luxury of working for fulfillment rather than necessity, which changed the nature of the work even if the tasks remained the same. Over the following months, I began to find ways to honor both my values and my inheritance responsibilities. Working with Elena's team, I established a foundation focused on educational opportunities for working-class students, something that felt aligned with both my teaching background and Grandpa Henry's belief in long-term thinking. I also created a fund for small business support in my neighborhood, helping entrepreneurs who reminded me of the person I'd been before inheriting unexpected wealth. But perhaps the most meaningful decision I made was about the Heritage Diner itself. Rather than continuing to work there as an employee while secretly being wealthy enough to own it, I approached the current owner about purchasing the business with plans to convert it to a cooperative model where long-term employees like Maria would become part owners. The negotiation process was more complex than I'd anticipated, requiring legal structures I didn't understand, and business valuations that seemed divorced from the diner's actual value to the community. But with professional help, we structured a deal that preserved what made the heritage special, while creating opportunities for the people who'd invested their careers in making it successful. "You're sure about this?" Maria asked on the day we finalized the ownership transfer. "Once you sign these papers, you're not just the boss. You're responsible for all of us." "I've been responsible for all of you for years," I said, signing the documents that made me a business owner rather than just a manager. "This just makes it official." But the real transformation in my life came through learning to navigate the ongoing complexity of family relationships that had been fundamentally altered by wealth distribution. The initial crisis had passed, but the underlying tensions remained, requiring constant negotiation and boundary setting. Victoria eventually stopped calling with investment advice and started inviting me to charity galas, where I could meet appropriate people who moved in philanthropic circles. Her approach was more subtle than Marcus's direct pressure, but the underlying message was the same, that my previous life was incompatible with my current resources and responsibilities. Marcus took a different approach, positioning himself as my reluctant protector against people who might try to take advantage of my naivete. He forwarded articles about inheritance scams and cautionary tales about wealthy people who'd been exploited by unscrupulous advisors. His concern was probably genuine, but it was predicated on the assumption that I was fundamentally incapable of protecting myself. The most challenging relationship to navigate was with extended family members who discovered that being nice to me might pay dividends. Christmas gatherings became exercises in distinguishing between genuine affection and strategic positioning, conversations loaded with subtle requests for support or investment opportunities. I learned to listen for the difference between people who cared about my well-being and people who cared about my bank account. But I also discovered that wealth, properly managed, could strengthen relationships rather than corrupting them. When Uncle Thomas's small construction company faced bankruptcy due to a client who refused to pay for completed work, I was able to provide luxury of working for fulfillment rather than necessity, which changed the nature of the work even if the tasks remained the same. Over the following months, I began to find ways to honor both my values and my inheritance responsibilities. Working with Elena's team, I established a foundation focused on educational opportunities for working-class students, something that felt aligned with both my teaching background and Grandpa Henry's belief in long-term thinking. I also created a fund for small business support in my neighborhood, helping entrepreneurs who reminded me of the person I'd been before inheriting unexpected wealth. But perhaps the most meaningful decision I made was about the Heritage Diner itself. Rather than continuing to work there as an employee while secretly being wealthy enough to own it, I approached the current owner about purchasing the business with plans to convert it to a cooperative model where long-term employees like Maria would become part owners. The negotiation process was more complex than I'd anticipated, requiring legal structures I didn't understand, and business valuations that seemed divorced from the diner's actual value to the community. But with professional help, we structured a deal that preserved what made the heritage special, while creating opportunities for the people who'd invested their careers in making it successful. "You're sure about this?" Maria asked on the day we finalized the ownership transfer. Once you sign these papers, you're not just the boss. You're responsible for all of us. I've been responsible for all of you for years, I said, signing the documents that made me a business owner rather than just a manager. This just makes it official. But the real transformation in my life came through learning to navigate the ongoing complexity of family relationships that had been fundamentally altered by wealth distribution. The initial crisis had passed, but the underlying tensions remained, requiring constant negotiation and boundary setting. Victoria eventually stopped calling with investment advice and started inviting me to charity galas, where I could meet appropriate people who moved in philanthropic circles. Her approach was more subtle than Marcus's direct pressure, but the underlying message was the same, that my previous life was incompatible with my current resources and responsibilities. Marcus took a different approach, positioning himself as my reluctant protector against people who might try to take advantage of my naivete. He forwarded articles about inheritance scams and cautionary tales about wealthy people who'd been exploited by unscrupulous advisors. His concern was probably genuine, but it was predicated on the assumption that I was fundamentally incapable of protecting myself. The most challenging relationship to navigate was with extended family members who discovered that being nice to me might pay dividends. Christmas gatherings became exercises in distinguishing between genuine affection and strategic positioning, conversations loaded with subtle requests for support or investment opportunities. I learned to listen for the difference between people who cared about my well-being and people who cared about my bank account. But I also discovered that wealth, properly managed, could strengthen relationships rather than corrupting them. When Uncle Thomas's small construction company faced bankruptcy due to a client who refused to pay for completed work, I was able to provide. The empty cigar box that had once held those transformative stock certificates sat on our mantel at home, a reminder that the most valuable treasures often come in humble packages. But the real treasure hadn't been the money itself. It had been learning that wealth, like any tool, was only as valuable as the purposes it served and the wisdom with which it was wielded. Standing in that crowded diner, surrounded by the noise and warmth of genuine celebration, I finally understood what Grandpa Henry had really left me. It wasn't just financial resources. It was proof that staying true to your values while embracing new opportunities was not only possible but necessary for a life well lived. The family who'd once celebrated my empty inheritance had learned, as I had, that sometimes the most valuable gifts are the ones that seem worthless until you understand their true purpose. And sometimes, the people others underestimate are exactly the ones who deserve the most important responsibilities. 3 years had passed since that life-altering afternoon in Mr. Lawson's conference room, and I was standing in the gleaming lobby of the newly opened Mitchell Community Learning Center, watching children from the neighborhood explore what would become their after-school sanctuary. The building had once been an abandoned department store, its broken windows and graffitied walls a symbol of urban decay. Now it housed computer labs, art studios, a commercial kitchen where teenagers could learn culinary skills, and a library that stayed open until 9 every evening. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had required 18 months of community meetings, architectural planning, permit applications, and the kind of patient relationship building that money alone couldn't accomplish. But standing there, watching 8-year-old Carmen teach her grandmother how to use a tablet while teenagers worked on college applications in the tutoring center, I felt the deepest satisfaction I'd ever experienced. David appeared beside me, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the center's cafe, which was staffed entirely by students earning work-study credits. His hair had grown longer over the past year, and he developed the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing his daily work mattered to people who needed it most. He'd taken a sabbatical from teaching to help manage the center's educational programs, bringing the same passion for learning that had made him an exceptional high school teacher. Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know if you have time to meet with the family literacy group, he said, nodding toward the classroom where Maria's sister-in-law was leading a session for parents learning to read alongside their children. They're hoping to expand the program to include job training components. The request represented exactly the kind of community-driven expansion I'd hoped would emerge from the center. Rather than imposing programs from above, we'd created space for neighbors to identify their own needs and develop solutions with professional support. The approach took longer than simply funding existing organizations, but it created ownership and sustainability that traditional charity couldn't match. Of course, I said, though I was also conscious of the time. Tonight was the annual Mitchell family dinner, a tradition that had become considerably more complex since my inheritance transformed family dynamics in ways we were all still navigating. The relationship with my family had evolved through phases that Dr. Torres, the wealth psychologist I still consulted occasionally, described as entirely predictable. Initial shock had given way to strategic positioning, which had eventually settled into cautious acceptance of new realities. Victoria still occasionally suggested investment opportunities or social connections that she thought would benefit me, but she'd learned to frame them as suggestions rather than imperatives. Marcus had stopped offering unsolicited legal advice and had even referred several pro bono cases to the center's legal clinic. But the most significant change had been in how family gatherings functioned. Where Christmas dinners had once been exercises in subtle hierarchy and competitive achievement reporting, they'd become more genuine exchanges about life challenges and accomplishments. My wealth had initially created distance, but over time it had enabled deeper honesty about what each of us was actually trying to accomplish. The irony wasn't lost on me that becoming the wealthiest family member had freed me from having to prove anything to anyone. The money had given me a kind of social immunity that allowed me to make choices based on personal values rather than family expectations. I could fund causes I cared about without seeking approval, support relatives who needed help without being seen as overreaching, and decline invitations to events that didn't interest me without being labeled antisocial. But perhaps the most unexpected development had been Victoria's gradual involvement in the center's programs. It had started when her daughter Emma, now 16, had volunteered for the summer arts program. Victoria had initially seen it as community service that would look good on college applications, but watching Emma work with younger children had revealed talents and interests that traditional academic environments hadn't nurtured. "Mom, you should see what Sarah's created here," Emma had told Victoria during one of our family dinners. "It's not like regular charity stuff where rich people write checks and feel good about themselves. This is actually changing how kids think about their possibilities." The comment had stung Victoria visibly, probably because it contained an implicit criticism of her own approach to philanthropy. For years, she'd written substantial checks to established charities, attending galas, and serving on boards where her social connections and business acumen were valued. But Emma's observation forced her to confront the difference between supporting institutions and transforming lives. To her credit, Victoria had asked to visit the center the following week, not as a potential donor, but as someone trying to understand what her daughter found so compelling about the work being done there. I'd given her a complete tour, introducing her to staff members and students, explaining our educational philosophy, and showing her the data about academic improvement among participants. "This is impressive," she'd said, examining the college acceptance letters posted on the achievement wall. "These kids are getting into schools I wouldn't have thought possible for students from this neighborhood." The comment revealed both genuine appreciation and the kind of unconscious classism that had shaped Victoria's worldview for decades. She was surprised that working-class teenagers could achieve academic excellence when given appropriate support and resources, as if intelligence and ambition were distributed along economic lines. But her surprise had led to genuine curiosity about educational equity and systemic barriers that prevented talented students from accessing opportunities. Over several months, Victoria had become one of the center's most effective advocates, using her social connections to bring other wealthy donors to see programs in action, rather than simply reading about them in grant proposals. "I never understood how much difference individual attention could make," she'd told me after watching a tutor work with a struggling reader. "I assumed good students succeeded and bad students didn't, but that's not how it works at all." The revelation had been transformative for Victoria, leading her to question assumptions about merit and achievement that had guided her thinking for years. She'd begun volunteering regularly in the literacy program, discovering that she had a talent for connecting with adult learners who were intimidated by traditional classroom environments. Marcus had taken a different path toward involvement with the center, initially offering legal services for contract negotiations and permit applications. His corporate law background made him extraordinarily effective at navigating bureaucratic requirements that might have delayed or derailed community-based projects. But working with center staff had exposed him to legal challenges facing low-income families that he'd never encountered in his commercial practice. "Do you know how many of these families are dealing with landlord exploitation?" he'd asked me after helping several students' parents navigate housing disputes. "How many are paying predatory loan rates because they don't have access to traditional banking? The legal system is completely stacked against people who can't afford representation." His discovery had led to the establishment of a legal clinic at the center, staffed by volunteer attorneys from Marcus's firm, who provided free consultations on housing, employment, and immigration issues. The work didn't generate revenue for his practice, but it had given him a sense of professional purpose that corporate deals couldn't provide. "I went to law school because I wanted to help people," he'd admitted during one of our conversations. "Somewhere along the way I got distracted by money and status. Working here reminds me why I wanted to practice law in the first place." The family dinner that evening was held at Victoria's house, a stunning Gold Coast penthouse that overlooked Lake Michigan. The space was elegant in ways that demonstrated excellent taste and unlimited budget, filled with art and furniture that belonged in magazines. But the conversation around her dining table had shifted significantly from the competitive status reporting that had characterized family gatherings in previous years. "Emma's been accepted to Northwestern," Victoria announced as we settled around the table, her pride evident but tempered by awareness that academic achievement was more complex than she'd previously understood. "She wants to study education policy, partly because of her work at the center." Emma blushed but looked pleased with the recognition. At 16, she developed the kind of social consciousness that came from spending time with people whose challenges were fundamentally different from her own. Her volunteer work had exposed her to students whose academic potential was constrained by circumstances rather than ability, leading her to think seriously about systemic solutions to educational inequality. "That's wonderful," I said, genuinely pleased that Emma had found direction that aligned with her values. The center's partnership with Northwestern's education school could provide internship opportunities if she's interested. The conversation that followed would have been impossible before my inheritance transformed family dynamics. We discussed education policy, urban development, and social mobility with the kind of depth that required genuine engagement rather than surface-level familiarity. Money had given all of us permission to care about issues beyond our immediate self-interest. Marcus shared updates about the legal clinic's expansion, describing cases that illustrated systemic problems requiring policy solutions rather than individual interventions. Victoria talked about her involvement in a coalition of philanthropists, working to reform how charitable organizations measured effectiveness. Even Uncle Thomas, whose construction company had benefited from several center contracts, spoke thoughtfully about how community development projects could create sustainable employment while addressing neighborhood needs. The transformation in our family conversations reflected broader changes in how we understood wealth and responsibility. Money had initially divided us by highlighting differences in achievement and status, but over time it had enabled more honest discussions about what each of us was actually trying to accomplish with our lives. "I have an announcement," I said as dinner wound down, looking around the table at faces that had become genuinely interested in each other's well-being rather than just competitive positioning. "David and I are expecting our first child." The response was immediate and joyful, but it was Victoria's reaction that surprised me most. She reached across the table to squeeze my hand, her eyes bright with tears that seemed entirely genuine. "Oh, Sarah," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's wonderful news. This baby is going to be so lucky to have parents who understand what really matters." The comment might have sounded condescending coming from the Victoria of 3 years ago, but I could hear the sincerity behind it. She'd learned, as we all had, that wealth without purpose was ultimately empty, and that the most valuable things in life couldn't be purchased or accumulated. After dinner, Victoria and I found ourselves on her terrace, looking out over the lake while the rest of the family continued conversation inside. The Chicago skyline glittered in the distance, a reminder of the broader community beyond our personal relationships. "I owe you an apology," Victoria said quietly, her usual confidence replaced by something more vulnerable. "I spent years treating you like you were failing at life because you made different choices than I did. I couldn't see that you were actually succeeding at things I didn't understand." The apology was unexpected and deeply moving. For so long, I'd wanted acknowledgement that my choices had value, that building relationships and serving community were accomplishments worthy of respect. Hearing Victoria recognize that meant more than I'd anticipated. We were measuring success differently, I said, offering her the grace I'd learned from David and from watching Grandpa Henry's example. You weren't wrong to value achievement and stability. I just needed different kinds of accomplishment to feel fulfilled. But you were building something real, Victoria insisted. All my achievements were about accumulating things: money, status, recognition. You were creating connections and opportunities for other people. The inheritance just gave you resources to do more of what you were already doing. Her observation captured something important about how the money had functioned in my life. Rather than changing my fundamental priorities, it had amplified my ability to pursue the values that had always guided my choices. The wealth had made me more myself rather than making me someone different. Grandpa Henry knew what he was doing, I said, thinking about the letter he'd left and his faith that I'd use his gift wisely. He understood that money is only valuable if you know what to do with it. He saw something in you that I missed, Victoria admitted. I was so focused on conventional markers of success that I couldn't recognize wisdom that came in different forms. As we stood there in comfortable silence, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that afternoon in the law office. The inheritance had brought challenges I'd never anticipated. Media attention, family pressure, the complex responsibility of managing wealth ethically. But it had also created opportunities to address problems I cared about in ways that were sustainable and transformative. The community center had become a model that other neighborhoods were adapting, proving that intensive local investment could create lasting change when combined with genuine community participation. The educational programs were producing measurable improvements in academic achievement, while building social connections that strengthened the entire area. But beyond the measurable impacts, the center had created something less tangible but equally valuable: proof that people with different backgrounds and resources could work together effectively when they shared common goals. Students, parents, volunteers, and staff had formed relationships that transcended traditional social boundaries. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria, who was now the center's community liaison, in addition to her role as a founding member of the Heritage Diner Cooperative. Mija, Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you'll speak at the literacy graduation next week. She says you're the reason she finally learned to read at 73. Mrs. Patterson had been one of my first regular customers at the diner, a woman whose sharp intelligence had been constrained by limited educational opportunities in her youth. The adult literacy program had given her skills she'd always wanted, but more importantly, it had connected her with other learners who understood the courage required to admit ignorance and seek knowledge. Of course, I texted back, already imagining the ceremony where adults who'd overcome shame and fear to develop new skills would celebrate with families and friends who'd supported their journey. These were the moments that made the complexity of managing wealth worthwhile: watching people discover capabilities they'd never known they possessed, seeing communities strengthen through shared investment in each other's success, understanding that money well used could create opportunities that rippled outward in ways that were impossible to predict or control. David appeared on the terrace, carrying our coats and wearing the slightly tired expression of someone who'd been managing family conversation for several hours. "Ready to head home?" he asked, though his smile suggested he'd enjoyed the evening despite its demands. "Ready," I said, hugging Victoria goodbye with genuine warmth that would have been unimaginable during our previous relationship. The inheritance had initially driven us apart, but working through those challenges had ultimately brought us closer than we'd ever been. The drive home took us through the neighborhood where the community center was located, past the Heritage Diner, where late-night shift workers were grabbing coffee before heading to factories and hospitals. These were the people whose lives had been most directly affected by how I'd chosen to use Grandpa Henry's gift, not because they'd received charity, but because they'd been given opportunities to build something meaningful for themselves and their families. "Nervous about the baby?" David asked as we pulled into our driveway, his hand finding mine in the darkness of the car. "Terrified," I admitted, though the fear was mixed with excitement about raising a child who would grow up understanding that privilege came with responsibility, but also grateful that we can give this kid opportunities we never had. "And teach them that opportunities come with obligations," David added, understanding as always the deeper implications of what we were discussing. Our house was modest by the standards of people with my financial resources, but it felt like home in ways that had nothing to do with size or luxury. We'd chosen the neighborhood carefully, wanting to raise our child in a place where economic diversity was normal, and where community connections mattered more than individual achievement. That night, as I lay in bed thinking about the day's conversations and the challenges ahead, I pulled out Grandpa Henry's letter, which I still read occasionally when I needed guidance about difficult decisions. His words about building something meaningful had proven prophetic in ways he probably couldn't have anticipated. The empty cigar box sat on my dresser, a reminder of how dramatically life could change when least expected. But the real lesson of the inheritance hadn't been about wealth at all. It had been about the importance of staying true to your values regardless of circumstances, and about the responsibility that came with having resources that could improve other people's lives. 3 years after that transformative will reading, I'd learned that money was indeed a powerful tool, but only when wielded by people who understood that its value lay not in what it could buy, but in what it could build. The family who'd once mocked my worthless inheritance had discovered, as I had, that the most valuable treasures often come disguised as ordinary gifts from people who understand what really matters. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the child growing inside me and the world they would inherit, not just the financial resources that Grandpa Henry had accumulated, but the much more valuable legacy of understanding that true wealth came from using whatever advantages you possessed to create opportunities for others. That lesson, more than any amount of money, was the real treasure hidden in that old wooden box. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.